My name is Cody Fullerton, and I'm the Data and Social Science Librarian at University of Manitoba Libraries. And I was asked by one of our science librarians to do a quick presentation on open data for their Open Science series. And I should say, full disclosure, I'm not a science librarian. I used to be. My first librarian job was science librarian, but I work in the social sciences now. I'm the librarian for the Faculty of Education at U of M and the Departments of Sociology and Criminology, as well as being the data librarian is kind of my functional role for the social sciences and humanities. But they asked me to do this, so I said, why not? So open data is kind of an interesting topic. I probably, in my role as the data librarian, deal with more, I deal with different kinds of data requests usually, stuff that isn't necessarily open, but that's kind of why I'm here. I can facilitate access to things that others might not be able to get their hands on. So what I'm going to do, let's see here, okay. I haven't used GoToWebinar very much, so I'm just familiarizing myself with everything again. Okay, so open data is structured data that is machine readable, freely shared, used, and built on without restrictions. So it's to be categorized as open data, it kind of has to hit all of those things. Freely shared, used, and built on without restrictions. And the open data movement, this isn't really a group, like a specific group. It's just kind of a thing, right? And it's very similar to what most academics are used to and familiar with, the open access movement. That's concerned with making scholarly publications freely available on the internet to everyone, particularly publications that have public funding, right? If something is funded publicly, the idea is that if something's funded publicly, it should be available publicly as well. So another kind of tenet of the open data movement, and I think maybe not everyone has this feeling, but that data as a public utility. So it's something that should be available to everyone, not just can be, right? Like there are those that believe that the internet should be a public utility, that everyone needs access to the internet to be able to live in a modern industrialized world, right? And that data should be by default open. So it's not that data is created, it's private, and then it's made open. It's that it should be open by default, and then if it needs to be, can be made to be private. And I kind of agree with that actually in most instances. And the open data movement has really been born from the open science and open source movements. So open science, I'm sure some of you are familiar with. It's it kind of harkens back to the open access movement, where science, especially science that has been funded with public funds, should be freely available so that others can use it and build on it. That's how science works. And then the open source movement is really more of a developer coder kind of thing, where if you create a piece of code, you can put it in a repository like GitHub, for example, and then anyone else can go in and take that and build upon it, right? And do with it what they need to do with it. So it really came from both of these, and they came together, open science, open source, and they said, well, science creates a lot of data, and open source kind of has the tools to share that data. So they came together, and it was right around the mid-2000s. So this movement, the open data movement, isn't very old. And there's some good, I didn't link to it here, but there's a really good article that kind of explains the history of the open data movement. But maybe I can share that in a little bit or at the end. Okay, so but there is some key things to remember about open data, and that is one of them is availability and access. So it must be available as a whole and at no more than a reasonable reproduction cost, preferably by downloading over the internet, for example, right? Typically, that's not technically free because you're paying for internet or somebody is paying for the access to the internet. But the data must also be available in a convenient and modifiable form. So typically, you don't want something that's proprietary and that's locked, right? Like data in a PDF, for example. It should be, a text file or a CSV file, something like that. That's kind of what that's getting at there. And these are kind of just best practices, right, for availability and access. There's a couple other things to remember, that reuse and redistribution, that the data must be provided under terms that permit reuse and redistribution, including intermixing with other data sets. If anyone is familiar with open access, there are copyright licenses that can go along with open access, the Creative Commons licenses. And so sometimes authors want their content to be, they say it can be reused, it can be chopped up, it can be taken apart, it can be whatever, but then some say that they want it to be specifically used in a specific way and only as a whole and that kind of a thing. So it just depends on what license they want, but for open data, they really don't want there to be any kind of license like that. They just want it to be available to anyone in any form, and for them to use how they wish. And then universal participation is the last one. Everyone must be able to use, reuse, and redistribute, right? There should be no discrimination against fields of endeavor, against groups or persons or groups. For example, non-commercial restrictions that would prevent commercial use. That's one of the Creative Commons licenses. No commercial use, right? You can specify that. Or restrictions for certain purposes. For example, only in education can this data set be used. Things like that aren't really allowed. Okay, so moving on to the benefits of open data, and I've just kind of cherry-picked a few that I thought were the most important. There's other benefits as well, but access to data supports innovation in the private sector by reducing duplication and promoting reuse of existing resources. And the second one, support for research, so that this is the big one for universities. Access to federal research data supports evidence-based primary research in Canada and international research communities, or in Canadian and international research communities. And then increasing government accountability. This is one that is probably most important to your average person. So increased access to government data and information provides the public with a greater insight into government's activities, service delivery, and probably most importantly to the general public is the use of tax dollars by the government. So I went through the open data portal for the Canadian government, and I found some of the, I didn't list the specific data sets, but I found some of the most common things that are looked at and the topics that are searched for the most and downloaded the most in terms of open data sets. So minimum wage, this is historical minimum wage and current. Permanent residency rates, so how many people Canada is accepting into the country through permanent residency. Temporary residence, especially student permit or study permit rates, right? How many students are coming into Canada to study. Fuel consumption rates. So this one was, I think this one was actually particularly interesting for 2020 because I don't know about any of you, but I was working from home for most of 2020 and I have a car and I usually carpool to work, and I might have filled, ever since I've been working from home, about March 20th, 2020, I don't think I've I probably put maybe 5 tanks of gas in my car, maybe, right? It might be less. So fuel consumption rates definitely dropped in 2020. The National Hydro Network just has a lot of information about all the different hydro dams and how much energy they produce and all that kind of stuff. And then the last one is national broadband data. And this one, again, I think it should always be of interest, but in 2020 it was of, and up to now, it's of particular interest because so many people were working from home or working remotely or whatever, or studying remotely. And so I've linked it here, and I'm just going to show you some of this data, and it's shown on this map here. So this is a map of Canada, and all these kind of black points is where there's typically good internet access in Canada, right? If you zoom in, I'm just going to zoom in on my hometown up in northern Manitoba, and we'll see the color that it represents. So as you can see, it's purple, right? The color of the roads. And if you look at the map over here, this means that this community averages less than 5 megabytes per second upload, 1 megabyte per second download. So that's very slow, especially if you're living somewhere like Winnipeg where the average is much higher. The average, we're definitely green in Winnipeg, I would say. So that's at least 50 megabytes download, 10 megabytes upload. Let's see, if we go down to Winnipeg, it's a big population center. It might not show it because of its size. Let's see. And you can see it's mostly blue around the city, and it's not showing it because it's part of the city, but it's definitely in the green. You can see down here there's green on the roads. So yeah, that's so you can look at internet speeds, the average internet speeds for anywhere in Canada, and you can actually also download. If you go to a slightly different page, you can download files for the internet speeds all across the country. And in 2020, University of Manitoba administration was actually really interested in what kind of internet access their students had, because they had to use it for school, right? And so they actually had a list of postal codes for all of the students across the country. And myself and another librarian helped them kind of use StatsCan data and a mapping software to map out which of their students in the country had access to less than that 5, or it might have actually even been less than 10 megabytes per second. It was either 5 or 10. Who had access to less than that? And usually 5 to 10 is right around what you would need for something like a video call, right? Which is how a lot of classes were being delivered, which is still how a lot of classes are being delivered. So they were really interested in that. So I got to help them with that, which was kind of fun and interesting. Just as an example of something you can do with data that's open, right? Okay. But as with most things, it's not a universal. Not all data can be open, legal for certain reasons. First one being privacy, right? A data set or information that contains personal information about an individual must not be released. That's in the Canada's Privacy Act. For security reasons, information or data that may pose security risks to institutions, to the government, or to vulnerable or targeted individuals or organizations must not be released, obviously. Confidentiality, information or data that impairs the government's ability to make some decisions cannot be released. So this one is probably one of the ones that's picked apart the most, because a lot of the times the government can claim confidentiality on something that might not require it, right? The terminology is a little bit loose, but just so you know, that's there. And then legacy information or data. So for old data, particularly, there can be a very high cost to making the resource, I say eligible for release here, or eligible to be, made to be put on the internet, basically, and to be made downloadable by whoever. That's something that has a very high cost a lot of the time. For example, old census reports that are just scans of writing, right? You have to go through and have someone code all of those answers to everybody's answers, and it takes a very long time. There's actually a group that's doing that. They're starting with the oldest of the old census, but yeah, it takes a lot of time and money to do that. Of course, there's legal and contractual limitations. So a data set may be subject to legal or contractual agreements that prevent it from being released, like limitations in data sharing agreements, third-party data, right, government organizations that collect data for federal use, but where the federal organization may not have the rights to publish it on open.canada.ca. That's where all of the open data for the federal government lives. A commercial license, data purchased from third parties, which have limited rights for distribution, and then also non-disclosure agreements. There's other things that can be kind of a legal limitation, but these are just some that I've come up with here. And then finally, there's also, and this one, you might be able to say it's kind of new, even though that sounds bad to say, are ethical and cultural limitations on open data. A data set may hold certain religious or sentimental value to its owners who do not wish to disclose it or to have limitations on its disclosure, right? For example, this is one that I've actually run into and seen, so this is why I'm including this. But for example, a recording of an indigenous song that is only sung during fall harvest. The owners, so the indigenous people, may only make this song available to the public during the time that it's ritually sung, right? And there's actually a specific platform now. It's a content management system called Recruitu that can facilitate this type of disclosure. So it's specifically for indigenous people to have like a data repository for all of their, cultural and heritage artifacts. Right. For example, recordings of music. This software is mainly used in the southern United States, Australia, and New Zealand, where it's heavily used. And you can do things like you can put a song on there, a recording of a song, or whatever it might be, and say, I only want people to be able to access this during this time of the year, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of things you can do with this software, which makes it really interesting. We've actually thought about getting an instance for the University of Manitoba for the province, but I don't know if that's going through or not. But so yeah, this is another limitation for open data. All right, so now that we're kind of familiar with open data, let's jump into some sources. So basically all open data lives on the internet, and a lot of data that's created that is open is created by governments. So I just have a few links here, some federal open data sources. So we have the Statistics Canada Open Data Portal for the Government of Canada, and then also the Canadian Institute for Health Information, or CIHI. They have an open data portal as well. There's also the Manitoba Collaborative Data Portal for the province, and then the City of Winnipeg also has its own. Brandon even has its own open data portal. And see if we just kind of quickly go to the Winnipeg data portal, they have it broken down by different topics, the budget, governance of the city, finance, maps, transit, city services, planning, all kinds of stuff like that. You can look up building permits, public notices. You can look at maps. Let's just see. There is a map on here of every tree that has been planted in the city. Yeah, tree inventory map. And you can see what kind of tree it was, what kind of tree it is, when it was planted, what street it's on, what side of the street, where exactly on the street it is, and if it's been marked for destruction or something like that. There's all this kind of stuff that you can, right? So this is just a kind of an interesting example. I remember when I found this, I was like, oh man, I want to look at the trees on my block, right? So like Winnipeg is, if you've ever been, right, in the summer, if you've ever been above the city or you see out the city, it's actually quite amazing how green Winnipeg is. But yeah, this is just a kind of an interesting map here that I like to use as an example. Oh. So that's the Winnipeg Open Data Portal. All right. And maybe there is someone studying the plants and trees in Winnipeg. It's possible. We have a big agriculture school, right? So that's that. Other open data sources. So I've got some international sources here. These are just ones that I thought were kind of pertinent and heavily used. So the United States Census Bureau, of course, just like StatsCan, that's the United States version. There's also Eurostat, that's for the EU, the entirety of the EU. Data and statistics for them. There's data from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank, from the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations as a whole. They all have their own data portals. Some of them share some data, and some of them pull from others. Like I know the UN pulls some stuff from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, for example. But typically, mostly work independently of each other. And I know the United Nations data also pulls from the United States Census Bureau. They pull from StatsCan. So, because the United Nations is almost the entire world. Okay, and I have some other open data sources here that are just kind of interesting, and I wanted to share with you, because typically you think of governments, and you might even think of research data, which we'll get into in a minute. But this other stuff is kind of interesting. So the first one is the street census. And I don't know if anyone's that familiar with the census, right? The Canadian census, for example. But in order to be included in the census, you have to have an address, right? Either a permanent or a temporary address, because they mail it to you, or they use addresses, permanent addresses, to sort all of the data and to say these people live here, these people live here, these people are here, these people are here, right? So if you don't have an address, you're not counted in the census, and that's a problem, right? So there's actually a bunch of cities in Canada, and I assume in the US too. I haven't really looked into the US very much, but they have this thing called the street census. And this was started by a bunch of nonprofits in Winnipeg, but now it's actually being funded by the city itself. Here's all the funders: Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, Women's Resource Center, Sloan Mission, Main Street Project. I know Main Street Project and Spence Neighborhood Association were two of the original founders, I'm pretty sure, but it's funded by the city of Winnipeg, by all of these different organizations. And it's because having data on as many people as you can in your city is important, right? So they've created two reports so far, one in 2015 and one in 2018. So they've done this twice. They were supposed to do it in 2020. They want to do it every 2 years. But of course the 2021 was postponed until, I think they're going to do it this summer if they can. I assume they'll be able to do it this summer. But yeah, so the street census, and I'm pretty sure there's one, Vancouver does it, Calgary, Edmonton, I think Saskatoon. So a lot of big cities in Canada are doing this. And of course, the bigger cities are the places where you have the most homelessness, typically. Yeah, and it gives all the partners there and everything. So it's actually a really interesting read, and you can go to the report here. They don't really have data sets available. You might be able to request that from them, but it's more given in a report style, more of an aggregated data report. That's how it's presented. So that's the street census. The next one is the Google Public Data Explorer, which is kind of interesting. One of the reasons a lot of people, if you're a researcher, you probably know about Google Scholar. And yes, there are advantages and disadvantages to Google Scholar. One of the disadvantages being you can't always access everything that you find. But Google, for better or worse, indexes the internet, right? And so they have access to a lot of different data portals all in one. So Eurostat, the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, Statistics Iceland, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Inter-American Development Bank. So there's all kinds of stuff. And you can do a search for data. And you can look at these big, also these big topics, World Development Indicators, Competitiveness Report, the IMF World Economic Outlook, international trade. So there's all kinds of stuff, right? International telecommunications, statistics. There's all kinds of stuff that you can look at. And it's very accessible and findable because everything Google uses their search algorithm, which is very advanced. It makes it easy to find things, even for someone who doesn't really understand or have much practice in using like a database search where it's keyword and not normal language, right? A normal language search. So the Google Public Data Explorer can be really interesting. And there's also, I thought I'd throw in this one, 538. It's kind of meant for storytelling and journalism in a data-driven way, and it has topics from all over the board. So if you go to the website, you can see there's everything from different kinds of polls to NBA predictions, club soccer predictions, how Americans view Biden's response to the coronavirus crisis, right? So that's like a poll, and it'll give you the source, the data, and all that kind of stuff, all the information that you want. How popular is Donald Trump right now? You know, all that kind of stuff. So it looks like that one was published January 20th, so that was inauguration day for Biden. There's all kinds of stuff available on here, and it's a really interesting place to get data, right? There's like pollster ratings, all kinds of stuff. COVID geography, how urban or rural is your states, all kinds of stuff like that. It can be a little American, U.S. heavy and focused, but there is stuff from all over the place. And you can pick which topics you want at the top if you want, or you can just kind of scroll through them all. So this is just, this is an interesting one that I came across a little while ago that I thought was kind of interesting. Okay. So now this isn't really, it's not really part of my position as the data librarian. I more facilitate access to data. We have another unit in the library called Research and Support Services, and they handle research data, which is, it can be open, that's why I'm covering it, but research data is an important component of the open data movement, and it has to, of course, has to do with universities and research and kind of science, right, and forwarding mankind's knowledge of the world, however you want to put it. But Dataverse is an open source research data repository software. And we subscribe to Dataverse. We have what's called an instance of Dataverse at the U of M. And it's meant to be used by our researchers for their research data. So it's a secure place to store your data, number one. And it can be easily shared. You can be either easily made open so that anyone can view it, or it can be shared among other members of a research team or of a lab or whatever it might be. And keep in mind that it's a repository. It's not meant to be used to view files of any sort. It can store pretty much any file that you want, whether it's a PowerPoint or a Word doc or an SAS file or whatever it might be. So I have information here on the Dataverse project, but I'm just going to quickly show you the University of Manitoba's Dataverse instance. So this is a page for Dataverse, Faculty and Researcher Help Dataverse. And the UM Dataverse link is right here. There's also a guide for researchers, which is really important to read if you do want to use Dataverse. So these are data sets that have been made open by whoever uploaded them to their Dataverse. And one really nice thing about it, which we'll be talking about in a minute, is it gives you a citation right off the bat to that data. Which, if you're familiar with data and using data that's already been created in a work, sometimes citing it can be a little bit tricky depending on what style you're using and all kinds of stuff like that. So you can search through. There aren't too many data sets you can see that are open, that have been created at U of M. We haven't had Dataverse for that long, maybe only a few years. So there's still a lot of people who just use, they just store data on their computer, or they store it on flash drives, or Google Drive, or whatever it might be. But this is meant to be a good, secure way to easily share stuff and make things open if you choose. And you can see our first instance of it was 2017, so that was maybe about 4 years ago. I have my own Dataverse instance. I'm a user, and I've used it for 2 different projects that I've done. But that data in particular has to be private, especially for one of my projects, because it's interviews of people and they're named in those interviews. So going back to the privacy issue of open data, that can't be open, right? So that's Dataverse. If you're not familiar with it, I just kind of wanted to make you familiar with it. It's meant for any kind of research. I saw for a second there maybe somebody had put their hand up, but I'm not sure. If anyone does have any questions, they can type them in the chat, or you can probably unmute and just ask. I'm pretty sure everyone can unmute themselves, but I'm not 100%. So Dataverse, good way to store your research data and share it, make it available, all that good stuff. The next thing I'm going to talk about is useful tools at the U of M for finding data, right? A lot of this is technically open data, but all of these things are tools that we subscribe to, we pay for our users, the U of M community, to be able to use. So the first one is Odyssey. And Odyssey is a discovery tool for data. That's really what it is. It's a way to search for specific data sets. And I'll just show you the platform here. This is Odyssey. You can browse Odyssey by subject. You can type in a search term, whether that's the title of a survey that you're looking for, or whether it's a variable like income or something like that. You can type that in here. You can specify the dates, the publication dates. You can say where you want to search for it. And again, if you're searching for the title of a survey, you could make this title. If you're specifically searching for a variable, you can make it a variable, all that good stuff. And another great thing about it is you can specify where you want to search. So this thing can search for microdata from StatsCan, which is surveys or the census, and it's every person's individual answers to the questions that a census asks or a survey asks. There's the aggregated data, so that's like data tables, data that's already been analyzed, public opinion polls in Canada, and then other data such as I think research institutes and Policy Research Network, Institute for Social Research, the International Social Survey Program, the Canada data only of that of course, but all those other things. So this side is pretty much all Canadian data. And then the additional collections are the StatsCan master files. Those are really hard to view because they're not anonymized. So there's a lot of privacy issues that go into these master files. They're just the raw answers from Census or a survey. You have to be vetted. It's a lot of money, and you have to actually typically go to Ottawa or sometimes a research data center to view the files. But you can search for them if you want. There's the Canadian Opinion Research Archive. There's the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. So that has mainly United States data, but there's also data from all over the world in that repository. And then there's the Canadian Dataverses, which is like our Dataverses. University of Alberta has one. The University of British Columbia has one. There's the Scholars Portal. So you can search just in Canadian Dataverses as well. So this is a useful tool, and you can search across multiple fields. All you have to do is just check and uncheck what you want to search. Right? So for example, if we searched income, I wonder if we just searched Dataverses. Okay, so we're just searching Canadian Dataverses for income, but that's anywhere, right? So personal income statistics by top. So this is a public master file. Okay. So yeah, and it'll usually tell you where it's from. So these are probably stored in Scholars Portal, I imagine. Top incomes in the long run of history. And you can just click Explore and Download. Yeah, this is a Scholars Portal. And then you can have access to that data set. For example, sometimes if you're searching within StatsCan, for example, it'll take you to a certain page of the StatsCan website, or it'll take you to the next thing we're going to look at, which is Nestar. Now, Odyssey does provide access to Nestar because Nestar is actually where a lot of StatsCan or all of the StatsCan public use microdata files are stored. So if it's a survey, if it's everybody's individual answers of a survey or of a census, they're all stored in Nestar. And that's going to be changing. I think this year they're moving platforms, but for right now, it's Nestar. And StatsCan public use microdata files are right here. And you can just go through, and these are all different kinds of surveys, right? The Canadian Internet Use Survey, changes in employment survey. There's all kinds of surveys. Impacts of COVID-19 on Canadians. So this is a very topical, right? So the StatsCan did 6 different surveys of Canadians over 2020 about COVID in particular, and they all have different topics. So there's the overarching one. There's the mental health component. There's the perceptions of safety component, right? Trust in others. Parenting during the pandemic, living with long-term conditions and disabilities. So those are all different surveys that you could actually just click on. Let's see, we want the perceptions of safety component. It brings it up here, and you can just download the microdata file right here. Up at the top, there's the little floppy disk icon. You can pick your format. What's one really nice thing about Nestar is it comes in all different kinds of formats. And that's one of the reasons that we subscribe to this, and so StatsCan gives it to us in a bunch of different formats, depending on what software you use for your analysis. There's all kinds of stuff. So for example, if you wanted the census, you can go to the census of population. If you're familiar with the census at all, you'll notice that 2011 is missing. We do the census every 5 years, but in 2011, we didn't have a full census because certain parts of the census weren't mandatory, so we couldn't technically call it a census. So that is the National Household Survey, or the NHS. But I promise you it's there. It's just loading for some reason. Okay, I've noticed someone's asked the question, but we're fairly close to the end, so I'm just going to answer the questions at the end. The last thing for useful tools at UM is the Canadian Census Analyzer, which is a really useful tool. It seems a little bit complicated, but I'll just kind of give you a quick rundown of something that I've done before. So you can do by geography, so how you want the data to be displayed by geography. You can do it by census year. So for example, if I want the data to be displayed by census tract, which are small chunks of big cities, basically, and I want it from the 2016 census, I can choose the location of Winnipeg as my city that I'm looking at. And then I want journey to work, and I want how long it takes people to get to work, right? All these different times. You can see they're all selected here. I don't need any special stuff. I just want it as a text in browser. You can hit go, and it gives you like little codes here, just like a microdata file would. And then it tells you what it means up at the top. So for example, commuting duration, 30 to 44 minutes of people over the age of 15 to work is COL3, so that's this one. And all of these different numbers here are what's called census tract codes, or geography codes. So Winnipeg, this is Winnipeg as a whole, right here, 602.0000.00. That's Winnipeg. So you have 92,000 people, 92,350 people that travel 30 to 44 minutes to work in Winnipeg, right? And then it breaks it down by each census tract. And you can get maps of census tracts. It's basically just a city broken up into different little sections. So all the different census tracts in Winnipeg. So this could be some very useful data if you're looking at how long it takes Winnipeggers to get to work based on this geography, right? So that's just a little example that I like to use for the census analyzer. And just in terms of time, I'm going to keep going. So we're almost at the end. Citing data. I've had quite a few questions about this. People emailing me, how do I cite this data set? All that kind of stuff. Just like research publications, data needs to be cited when it's used, right? If you're going to cite an article, if you're going to use an article in your publication, you're going to cite it. If you're going to use a data set in your publication, you need to cite it. And some citation styles still don't have specific methods for citing data. More of the science styles typically do. APA just kind of worked it in with their newest 7th edition, but some aren't. Some are kind of broad and not very specific, so a lot of people can find it difficult to cite. A lot of places on the internet, if there is a data set, for example, like our Dataverse, it kind of tells you how to do it. You might have to change that up a little bit depending on your citation style, but it gives you all the elements that you need, right? Creator, author, year, title, URL, DOI, and then publication place, all that kind of stuff. So it gives you all the information that you might need, which is nice. And I have more information on citing data at this link here, which it links to a subject guide that I have for data. And yeah, there's more information there, and I link out to other places that talk about citing data more. Typically, these are the elements that you want, and you just kind of have to put them in place where your style says to, right? Author, creator, year, or last update, because sometimes these kind of things can be updated. Title or description, publisher, distributor, right, or whichever database or repository it's in. Whatever the unique identifier is, whether that's a URL or a DOI, and any other elements the creator or publisher asks you to include, right? I assume for this particular one here, this V1, that's version 1 of this data set. Versions are important when talking about data, so that's kind of a basic what to include right there. All right, so we did start a little bit late, apologies for that, but I am just going to get into this one question that I got here, and I'm just going to quickly read it over. Okay, so this person's asking about, this is a good question, about qualitative data in these repositories. So all the ones that I've talked about. I mentioned named people in interviews that I had done. I would say that publishing raw data in a database would have some ethical hoops. Exactly. So one of the things that we did, and because we did this, we might be able to make it open. I think we kind of skipped over this part about thinking about making our data open. But if it's coded, like you couldn't just, like the interview answers themselves are a form of data, right? For example, of qualitative data. But if you coded the answers into, interviewee 1, interviewee 2, and how they answered each question, giving it a number or a letter or something like that, or a series of letters as to how they answered the question, that kind of thing can typically be, it can be kind of turned into quantitative data in a way. And we did that. We did code our data for that specific project. But even that, because our group, our pool was Indigenous researchers at the University of Manitoba, so the pool is already very small. So that has to be considered too. And if someone knows, if you know someone and they're the only person that answered that way on the survey, for example, depending on the question, you might be able to pick out who that was. So there are some considerations like that too. I think that's probably one of the reasons we couldn't make ours open. But yeah. But they're probably, I would say these repositories definitely lean heavily towards quantitative data, and qualitative it's much harder because of privacy concerns to make open. I think that's just the reality of it. Yeah, it is impossible to fully anonymize. And speaking of anonymizing data, remember I mentioned the StatsCan master files as compared to the public use microdata files. As you can see here, the master files, or the aggregate data, pumps as we call them, public use microdata files. Pumps have been anonymized, and that's why they're available to the public, whereas master files haven't. So for example, one of the best examples that I've ever heard that I use all the time is if you're looking at a city, a town, it can be a 500 people town, a population of 500, a population of 20 million. How many people in that town have the occupation of mayor, right? One person. So that's an example of something that would be anonymized out of the raw answers, and it wouldn't be included in the public version of that file. One downside of that is that it makes the file less accurate, but StatsCan and all their statisticians, they make sure that the information is still valid and useful, right, before they publish it. If it couldn't, and they've done this, there's been data that they've collected that they couldn't anonymize enough in order to meet privacy laws, so they just can't publish the data. It happens quite often, actually, because sometimes they survey a specific group of people, and if that group is small enough, sometimes it's almost impossible to anonymize the data enough and still have it be usable. So if that's all, I will log off for the day, and thanks everyone for coming.